International Monetary Fund has projected that India's GDP will stay ahead of China's in 2017 as well as in 2018. In its World Economic Outlook update, the agency retained India's GDP rate at 7.2% for the current fiscal year and predicts a 7.7% growth for 2018. In the case of China, the forecast has been marginally raised to 6.7% for 2017 and 6.4% for 2018. Many observers are saying the economic pole of global growth has moved from China to its neighbor India over the past few years. Is that really the case, or is it the whole picture? Seen by many as big competitors, how will the two countries navigate their future cooperation? Joining me in the studio is Zhang Jianping, a senior researcher with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation at the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. And from New Delhi, we have Mr. Ravi Buttalingam, an honorary fellow from the Institute of Chinese Studies. Let me start with you, Mr. Zhang. Not only the IMF, but a few days ago, a Harvard University study projected much faster growth for India than China. It predicted that China's growth could fall below 5%, to be exact 4.4% in the coming years until 2025, while India will perform very well, growing about 7% during the same period. How do you look at the projections?
I think that in theory, this type of scenario would be possible. But don't forget that today China's GDP scale is already, on the second place in the world. Very big economy scale. So that means even if lower a little bit growth rate, but you know that economic growth, this part is also still will be very huge. Another thing is that I think that for India, if you look at India population already, about 1.3 billion, very close to China, but its per capita GDP only about $1,800. So that means in India, the development demand will be very huge. So nowadays, India started to promote, made in India, and then they will enjoy, high growth rate. But in practice, that will, if India can maintain more than 7% high growth rate, that will rely on if India will keep their, opening up, and if they can attract enough, FDI inflow, or if India can, keep their, policy.
Ravi, are you optimistic about India's growth as IMF and Harvard?
Firstly, thank you for having me on the show. Yes, indeed, I'm very optimistic about India in the years going forward. There are several factors which provide us a tailwind. One is that the economic conditions in India are very ripe at the moment to maintain a rapid growth rate. Inflation is low. The agricultural income this year is expected to be good. Oil prices and commodity prices continue to be low, and those have been a major part of India's expenditure. And the government's initiatives on Make in India, as my co-panelist just mentioned, and other initiatives to unblock investment and get the manufacturing growth engine moving are beginning to show dividends. So there is indeed a good expectation, and that is shared by the Indian stock market if you've been following it, is that India is in for a period of good growth. And we expect that because India is also demographically in a good spot, which by that I mean that a large number of people are in the younger age groups, the government is working very hard to provide them with relevant skills so that they can contribute to manufacturing in particular.
Ravi, you've been pointed out all the positive sides of India's economy, but still many people are worrying about
That's right.
something that is not so positive, like the bureaucracy in India and also some trade protectionist impulses in India that's keeping investors having second thoughts about investing in India. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Well, I think in many countries one has these problems, and particularly in a large and complex country like India, there are certain provinces which will move much faster than other provinces. There are certain industries which will move faster than other industries. And a government of a large country like India, as indeed China, has to keep in mind regional variations, regional disparities, and see that the country as a whole is on an even track. Now, this requires a certain amount of regulation and indeed bureaucracy. By bureaucracy, I mean officialdom, not bureaucracy in the sense of holding you back. But wherever there is bureaucracy and there are these regulations, you can have some effects which may not be all that positive. So it's always a mix of the positives and some obstacles.
I want to talk about...
But we have to see in the overall, how does the picture look?
I want to talk about
Yes,
China-India
indeed.
relations.
Please.
Amid the standoff between China and India over the Sikkim border, activists and educationists and even civil society in India are calling for boycott of Chinese goods. Is this a mainstream voice in Indian society? How it will impact the transactions between the two major economies in Asia? Let me take first from Ravi and then Mr.
Ultimately, okay. Well, ultimately, things work on the basis of supply and demand. And if there is a genuine demand for goods or services on both sides, goods and services.
But the demand is there, but the political voices or noises have actually obstacled the free trade flow between the two, hasn't it?
Well, I think the total trade is still in the region of about $70 billion, which is much more than what was about 10 or 12 years ago. It did not reach the figure of 100 billion, which we were hoping it would. But in the middle, there were all kinds of disruptions in the economic scenario, including the great financial crisis. Indeed, China-India economic relations have the potential of going even further. And as far as the problems that you mentioned, I think countries like China and India, which are mature countries, can handle these problems without affecting economic relations between them. For example, China and Japan have a very thriving economic relations, although you also have a few problems. Similarly, China and the United States have some problems, but you have a very thriving economic relation. So I think we can manage to improve our connectivity in economics and business while we tackle these other problems, which I'm confident that we will resolve.
So, Mr. Zhang, do you agree that the political differences won't spill over into economic areas, as Ravi just mentioned?
I think that actually political factors and economic factors, all of them will work together and impact the situation. But I don't think that a boycott this type of things will be the mainstream in Indian society. If you look at the trade data between China and India, every year trade volume about 70 billion US dollars, but China's export to India about 60 billion US dollars, but India to China only about 100 billion, 10 billion US dollars. That means India's side has a very huge trade deficit for Chinese against the Chinese side. Don't forget that today India poor people and India middle class, actually they are deeply enjoy those those products made in China that's belonging to affordable products. So in case that a boycott happened, I'm afraid that those poor people and the middle class will suffer from that process.
So Ravi, it seems that the lack of progress in the economic field has a lot to do with the lack of political trust between the two. In the first half of 2017, 12 of 35 trade remedy investigations against China's export products came from India, and also India's reluctance to join the China-sponsored Belt and Road Initiative. Why India is so suspicious of China's initiative?
Well, let me answer the point you made about the economic growth from India's side, the deficit being too high. Now, I think this is really the factor that needs to be tackled, because in any trade relationship which has great potential, and the India-China trade relationship has very great potential because of their being large countries and big economies, some of the obstructions and blockages which obstruct the growth of trade have to be tackled. And I think the problem here is not really the Belt and Road situation. The problem here is there is insufficient and detailed understanding in India of how the Chinese market works, and in China about how the Indian market.
What needs to happen
and
to
we need
improve
to study
that?
this in much more greater. Well, let me give you an example of pharmaceuticals. Now, India is well known as one of the world's cheapest and most high quality producer of generic drugs. We export a lot of these to the United States under FDA regulated conditions. But it has been a problem getting these drugs permission to be sold in China.
I think
At
China has
time,
the same concern,
China
Mr.
has
Zhang.
an issue
Chinese
of reducing.
companies are having troubles investing and making businesses in India because of the blockades from the government.
Even like that, actually now every year China's investment in India
I think this is
$5 billion US. That's a big number. You know that every year for India, FDI inflow only about $45 billion US. So in this regard, I think that maybe the situation will impact bilateral investment relationship.
Both sides have complained about the trade practices and policies, but we're running out of time. Thank you very much, Ravi, and thank you, Mr. Zhang, for your analysis. Mr. Zhang Jianping from Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Ravi Butlingam from Institute of Chinese Studies. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point.